Beneath an old university library, a forgotten basement woke up after 50 years of silence. Hundreds of microfilm reels waited on metal shelves, each labeled with the same unsettling message: for the unborn generation. When the first reel was played, there were no words, no warnings, only a pair of eyes staring back, as if recognizing the viewer. And in that moment, one truth became terrifyingly clear. The future had been watching us long before we ever looked back. The rain had been falling over the city since dawn, thin and patient, the kind that never announced itself with thunder, but seeped into stone and memory alike. The university sat on the northern edge of the old quarter, its Gothic towers darkened by decades of weather, its limestone walls streaked with moss like veins beneath aging skin. Wind pushed fallen leaves across the empty courtyard, and the bell tower clock, long unsynchronized, struck the wrong hour without apology. To the city above, it was just another wet evening. Beneath it, something ancient stirred. Far below the library's lowest public floor, a signal passed through forgotten cables, a quiet experimental sweep never meant to wake anything at all. It was brief, clinical, and blind to history. Yet the basement heard it. Electricity, absent for nearly 50 years, returned in a low hum that rolled through concrete like a held breath finally released. Lights flickered on one by one, revealing a level that did not exist on any architectural blueprint, a hidden floor carved during a time when secrecy had been considered a form of patriotism. A man stood at the center of it. He was alone, or believed he was. Tall, broad-shouldered without being heavy, his posture carried the instinctive balance of someone used to narrow margins and sudden decisions. His coat was dark and rain-dampened, cut with practical elegance rather than fashion, and beneath it his movements were economical, as if every gesture had been rehearsed by necessity rather than vanity. His face bore the quiet severity of a man who rarely wasted expressions. Clean-shaven, angular, eyes alert but restrained, the kind that noticed exits before art and listened more than they spoke. Whatever softness he might once have had been sanded down by years of purpose, though a trace of it remained in the way he paused, listening before taking each step. The basement answered his presence with silence. Rows of metal shelves stretched into the shadows, each holding cylindrical canisters carefully arranged like relics awaiting worship. Dust lay thick but undisturbed, except for the faint tremor still traveling through the floor as systems reawakened. The air smelled of cold iron, old paper, and something faintly electrical, like a storm trapped indoors. On each canister, the same line had been printed in precise, unfading ink: for the unborn generation. At the far end of the room stood the microfilm reader. It was an old machine, beige casing yellowed by age, edges softened by time, the kind of device museums displayed behind glass with warning plaques. And yet, as the power surged fully, its indicator light glowed a steady green, flawless, almost eager. The man approached it with caution, fingers brushing the surface as if expecting warmth or resistance. There was none. The machine was alive in a way machines were no longer meant to be. He selected the first canister at random. The metal was cool and heavier than expected. When he slid the reel into place, the reader accepted it without protest, mechanisms aligning with a smoothness that bordered on reverence. The screen flared to life. No text appeared. No numbers, no diagrams, no codes. Only an image. A pair of eyes filled the frame. They were human eyes, brown, reflective, unblinking, framed so close that every line and imperfection was visible. They did not flicker like old footage should have. They did not drift. They simply looked outward, fixed and deliberate, as though the image were not being viewed, but was instead doing the viewing. The man felt an involuntary tightening in his chest, a primitive recognition that had nothing to do with logic. He had spent his life being watched, assessed, measured. This was different. This was intimate. The eyes seemed to adjust, as if focusing. Behind him, something moved. A low metallic clang echoed through the basement, followed by another, deeper this time. Steel doors slid from hidden recesses, sealing off stairwells and service corridors with the finality of a vault closing. Red emergency lights ignited along the ceiling, bathing the room in a pulse that mimicked a heartbeat. The microfilm reader emitted a sharp tone, then another, escalating into a steady alarm that vibrated in the bones. The air changed. Ventilation slowed, then recalibrated, restricting flow to a narrow margin. The man noticed it immediately, drawing a measured breath, calculating time the way others calculated money. Somewhere in the system, protocols long forgotten had awakened, and they did not care who he was or why he had come. To them, he was an anomaly. On the screen, the eyes blinked once. A countdown began on a secondary panel, numbers descending with mechanical indifference. Data purge sequence initiated. The shelves around him shuddered as internal locks engaged, canisters retracting into sealed compartments one by one, history pulling itself inward like a creature protecting its core. He moved. His steps were swift but controlled, boots striking concrete with practiced precision as he scanned for overrides, for anything that suggested human design rather than blind automation. The basement resisted him at every turn. Panels that should have opened remained inert. Controls responded too slowly, or not at all. This place had not been built to be accessed under pressure. It had been built to deny. The alarm deepened, a frequency designed to disorient, to induce panic. He felt it press against his temples, but refused to let it take hold. Panic was a luxury. He crossed the room toward a maintenance alcove just as the lights flickered violently, plunging the basement into stuttering darkness. For a moment, only the eyes on the screen remained visible, glowing faintly, watching. The air grew thinner. He reached the alcove and forced open a panel with brute insistence, exposing a tangle of aging wires and manual switches. His hands moved with certainty born of repetition, cutting power here, rerouting there, working against a system that seemed almost offended by his interference. Sparks flew. The smell of ozone sharpened. The countdown reached its final seconds. The microfilm reader let out a single, sustained tone. The eyes on the screen widened, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Then the image vanished. The lights died. Silence crashed down, absolute and heavy, broken only by the distant groan of settling metal. The alarms ceased mid-note. The ventilation stopped entirely. In the sudden darkness, the basement felt smaller, closer, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Somewhere above, the rain continued to fall, indifferent and unbroken. Below, there was no sound at all, no movement, no breath. Only the echo of a place that had woken up long enough to remember why it had been buried, and then chosen to sleep again. Whether the man had escaped, or whether the basement had claimed him as it had claimed so many secrets before, remained unknown. The city, unaware, went on breathing. Morning arrived late over the city, dragging a low ceiling of cloud behind it, the rain now reduced to a cold mist that clung to stone and wool. The university appeared unchanged on the surface. Students crossed the courtyard with coffee cups and tired jokes, bicycles leaned against wrought iron railings, and the library doors sighed open and shut as they had for generations. Yet something beneath the building had shifted, and the structure seemed to carry the quiet tension of a sleeper who had dreamed too vividly to return to rest. 2 blocks away, Ethan Caldwell sat inside a parked sedan, watching the upper windows of the library through rain-speckled glass. Ethan was in his early 40s, tall and solidly built, not bulky but resilient, the kind of man whose strength revealed itself only under strain. His dark hair was cropped close, silver beginning to show at the temples, and his face bore the disciplined symmetry of a life lived under restraint. Sharp cheekbones, a straight nose that had once been broken and healed imperfectly, and eyes a muted gray that missed very little. He moved through the world with deliberate economy, speaking only when necessary, listening always. Years earlier, a compromised operation had taught him that hidden systems were more dangerous than visible threats, and since then, caution had shaped his temperament into something bordering on austerity. He had been given a narrow brief: investigate an anomalous signal traced to the university library. Nothing more, no basement, no archive, just a signal that, by every rule he trusted, should not have existed. Inside the library, the smell of old paper and damp coats lingered in the air. Ethan entered like any other visitor, his presence intentionally forgettable, his steps unhurried. He exchanged a few polite words with the librarian, noted the exits, the reflections in glass, the subtle delay in the building's internal network that suggested a recent power draw. The public systems showed nothing abnormal. Still, he felt it, a faint pressure like standing near a sealed door with something breathing on the other side. On the second floor, Margaret Whitmore stood between two towering shelves, a folder tucked under her arm. Maggie was in her late 30s, slender, slightly taller than average, her posture shaped by years of archival work rather than comfort. Her hair, a warm brown that caught hints of gold in good light, was tied back loosely, strands escaping without apology. Her face was expressive in a quiet way, dominated by observant eyes that lingered where others skimmed. She had learned early that omissions spoke louder than preserved facts. A mentor's dismissal of her early research as inconvenient had hardened her resolve without souring her nature. Maggie was patient with people, exacting with documents, and deeply uncomfortable with explanations that felt too neat. She had spent weeks reviewing maintenance records, chasing a pattern that refused to align. 50 years without a single logged repair in a building, this old defied probability. That morning she had traced the absence to a shelving section that appeared repeatedly in maps but never in reports. As she replaced the folder, she sensed movement behind her. A man stood several meters away, pretending to browse. He was of average height, wearing a neutral jacket and sensible shoes, his hair thinning at the crown. There was nothing remarkable about him except the way he watched reflections rather than books. Maggie shifted position. The man adjusted his stance. She walked toward the reading tables. He followed at a respectful distance. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. Patterns again. She turned down an aisle rarely used, stopping at a shelf marked with obsolete classification numbers. The man slowed, pretending interest in a nearby volume. Maggie's fingers brushed the spines absently until she felt it. A slight resistance, a book that did not pull free but pressed inward instead. She hesitated only a moment before applying pressure. The shelf moved, not abruptly but smoothly, rotating on a hidden axis with the whisper of well-oiled mechanics. Rows of books slid aside, revealing a narrow opening behind them. Cool air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of metal and dust. Maggie's breath caught, not in triumph, but in disbelief. She had theorized hidden access points, but this was something else entirely, deliberate and elegant. Footsteps sounded behind her, closer now. She slipped through the opening just as the shelf began to rotate back into place, sealing the passage with practiced precision. The space beyond descended in a tight spiral stair, lit by low red emergency lights. Maggie moved downward, heart racing, aware that she had crossed from curiosity into consequence. At the base of the stair, the hidden level opened into a room lined with metal shelves and unfamiliar machines. The air was colder here, tinged with ozone. The silence felt intentional, as if imposed rather than natural. She took a cautious step forward and stopped. "Don't move." The voice came from the shadows, calm, controlled. Ethan stepped into the light, hands visible, posture neutral but ready. Seeing her there startled him, not because she was a threat, but because she didn't belong. He noted the archival badge, the ink-stained fingers, the steady way she met his gaze despite the tension in her shoulders. She was out of place, but not unprepared. "You shouldn't be here," he said evenly. Maggie exhaled slowly. Neither should a rotating bookshelf. For a fraction of a second, something like amusement crossed Ethan's face before discipline reclaimed it. The basement was quiet now, the systems dormant after their earlier awakening, but the sense of being observed remained, heavy and unresolved. "I'm asking you to leave," Ethan said. "This isn't safe." Maggie glanced past him at the shelves, at the machine still faintly warm. 50 years of erased maintenance records, she replied softly. Someone wanted this forgotten. Above them, muffled footsteps passed along the library floor, unknowing. Ethan considered the risks with practiced speed. He had been trained to contain anomalies, not explain them. But the anomaly had already widened to include her. "If you're going to ask questions," he said quietly, "we shouldn't do it here." Maggie nodded once, a small, resolute gesture. "Then we should move before whoever followed me realizes the shelf doesn't lead to a dead end." They stood together in the red-lit stillness, strangers bound by coincidence and curiosity, the hidden door behind them already turning back into place, erasing itself as if nothing had ever opened at all. The hidden level did not welcome prolonged presence. After the shelf sealed itself above them, the silence returned with weight, thicker than before, as if the basement were recalibrating to the fact that it now held two intruders instead of one. The red emergency lights softened into a dim amber glow, revealing the scale of the place more clearly. Rows of metal shelving that extended farther than the eye could comfortably measure, tracks embedded in the floor suggesting movement, and at the center, the microfilm reader, still intact, waiting. Ethan stood slightly ahead of Maggie, not as a shield but as a habit, his body angled to see both her and the surrounding space. Maggie noticed it without comment. She had grown up around people who tried to protect her ideas rather than her person, and she understood the difference. They did not speak at first. The machine broke the silence on its own, emitting a low hum that vibrated faintly through the soles of their shoes. Maggie approached it with a reverence she reserved for original manuscripts, her fingers hovering just above the controls before she touched them. She was slim, but there was a contained strength in her movements, the confidence of someone who trusted process more than instinct. "This model was discontinued in the early 70s, she said quietly, more to herself than to Ethan. "It shouldn't even recognize modern power input." Ethan watched her hands, steady, precise, and nodded once. He had seen obsolete systems revived before, but never without signs of decay. This one behaved like it had been waiting. They loaded a reel at random. The label was identical to the others. For the unborn generation. The screen flickered, then stabilized. This time, there were words, dates, places. A grainy map outlining a coastline Maggie recognized immediately, followed by a sequence of economic indicators that made her breath hitch. She cross-checked the year in her head. "That collapse happened 12 years later," she said. "Down to the quarter." Ethan felt a tightening behind his ribs. He had lived through the aftermath of that collapse, seen the panic it had seeded. He reached for another reel, then another. Each time the pattern held. Elections overturned, pandemics predicted, conflicts mapped in chilling accuracy, not as speculation, but as memory written in advance. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. Maggie's excitement was tempered by dread, her mind racing ahead even as she forced herself to document what she saw. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but inside, training collided with something older, less disciplined. Intelligence agencies dealt in forecasts, probabilities, margins of error. This was not that. This was certainty, archived and hidden like contraband. "These aren't instructions," Maggie said finally. They're letters, records meant to be opened later. She gestured at the shelves. They didn't want to change events. They wanted someone to understand them. As if in response, the basement shifted. A low rumble passed through the floor, subtle enough that Maggie wondered if she had imagined it. Then, one of the shelves to their left slid backward along its track, rotating 90 degrees to reveal a narrow corridor where there had been solid metal seconds earlier. At the same time, a distant clang echoed from behind them. Ethan turned, his posture sharpening. The shelf that concealed the stairwell above was moving, rotating slowly, inexorably, sealing itself more completely than before. "That's not mechanical decay," he said. "That's command-driven." They moved together now, instinct aligning without discussion. Maggie gathered her notes, slipping them into her bag. Ethan tested the newly revealed corridor, scanning for pressure changes, listening. The air smelled different there, cooler, filtered. As they stepped inside, the corridor lights activated in sequence, guiding them forward like a path chosen on their behalf. Behind them, another shelf rotated, closing the way back. Maggie swallowed. "It's rearranging itself," she said. "Like it's responding." They reached a secondary chamber smaller than the main archive, its walls lined with framed documents protected behind thick glass. Photographs stared back at them, men and women in white lab coats, some smiling awkwardly, others solemn. Maggie leaned closer, reading the captions. American names, American institutions, dated late 1950s through early 70s. "This is the project," she said. "The people behind the reels." One photograph lingered on her longer than the rest. A woman in her 30s, dark hair pinned back severely, eyes sharp with conviction. The caption identified her as Sarah Whitaker. Maggie felt an unexpected pull. Sarah had the look of someone who had argued too often to remain gentle. Notes beneath the photo described her role as an ethical theorist attached to a predictive sciences group, a combination Maggie had never seen officially acknowledged. Ethan scanned the room, his gaze pausing on a wall-mounted console older than the rest, its interface analog, switches worn smooth by use. "They built safeguards," he said, "not just to protect the data, to protect the idea." Maggie nodded, piecing it together. A Cold War project conceived at a time when the future was treated as a weapon to be controlled. These scientists had chosen a different approach: observe, record, and preserve consequences rather than strategies. They had hidden their work not to dominate tomorrow, but to teach it. The library was not a vault, it was a message in a bottle. Another tremor passed through the room, stronger this time. Lights flickered. Somewhere beyond the walls, mechanisms engaged with renewed urgency. A panel on the console illuminated, displaying a status Maggie didn't like the look of. External access attempt detected. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Someone else is knocking," he said, "and they don't have a key." He moved to the console, fingers hovering as if wary of waking something else. Maggie felt the weight of the moment settle over her, the realization that knowledge, once found, rarely remained unchallenged. They did not see who was interfering, only the effects. Doors they had passed sealed themselves. The corridor behind them vanished, shelves rotating into new configurations. The archive was no longer static, it was defensive, dynamic. Maggie steadied herself against a table as another reel began to spin on its own in the reader across the room, activated remotely. The screen displayed a line of text alone. "If you are seeing this, the future is still listening." Ethan exhaled slowly. "This place was designed to wake up," he said, "but not to be owned." Maggie met his gaze, fear and awe braided together. She understood now why the records had been erased, why the maintenance logs had gone silent. This wasn't negligence. It was protection. The lights dimmed again, settling into a low, steady glow. The external interference paused, as if reassessing. For the moment, the basement held. But both of them knew the balance had shifted. The message had been received. And somewhere beyond the walls, someone else had heard the echo. The basement's balance did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, and then gave way with the soft inevitability of ice cracking under careful weight. After the external interference paused, the archive settled into a deceptive calm. Lights steady, mechanisms quiet, as if considering its next move. Ethan stood near the console, shoulders squared, listening to frequencies humans rarely noticed, while Maggie moved among the shelves with a scholar's care, cataloging what she could before the place decided otherwise. It was Maggie who saw the reel first, not because it announced itself, but because it refused to blend in. Unlike the others, it bore no date, no location, no institutional mark. Its label was a single line, printed with unsettling intimacy. For the one who is watching. Maggie's breath slowed as she lifted it. She was slight of build, but there was resolve in the way she handled fragile things, learned from years of protecting truths others preferred to erase. "This wasn't meant for a generation," she said quietly. "It was meant for a moment." They loaded the reel together. The machine accepted it with a faint click, different from the others, almost respectful. The screen illuminated, not with maps or data, but with a recorded image that felt uncomfortably present. A woman appeared, seated at a desk under harsh light, her posture upright, her expression unyielding. Sarah Whitaker, older now than in the photograph Maggie had studied earlier, lines etched around her mouth and eyes by years of argument and disappointment. She was tall and lean, her dark hair pulled back severely, not out of vanity, but habit, as if any loose strand might distract from what needed to be said. Her eyes held a sharpness born of conviction, but there was fatigue there too, the kind earned by standing between ideas and institutions that wanted them simplified. "If you are seeing this," Sarah said, her voice steady but warm, "then the archive has opened at the wrong time and the right one." She spoke directly to the camera and somehow to them. She explained without preamble that the project had anticipated interference, that secrecy could delay greed but never outlast it. The reel was not a forecast, it was a charge. "Do not hide this again," Sarah said. "Hiding teaches fear. Understanding teaches restraint." The message cut abruptly, replaced by a status alert that pulsed red across the screen. External breach detected. Ethan did not need the console to tell him what his body already knew. The basement systems flared, lights snapping to emergency brightness, just as the first gunshot cracked through the concrete corridors. It was a sharp modern sound, violently out of place among the analog hums and whirs. Maggie flinched. Ethan did not. He moved, fluid and decisive, pulling Maggie behind a reinforced shelving unit as glass shattered somewhere to their left. "They're not here for us," he said, voice low, controlled. "They're here for this?" The attackers came with professional efficiency. They wore dark tactical gear without insignia, faces obscured by visors, movements precise, rehearsed. One of them barked orders in a clipped accent that placed him far from the city above, a man named Victor Hale, judging by the name patch hastily torn from his sleeve. Hale was stocky, thick-necked, his posture forward-leaning like someone who believed momentum was a weapon. His reputation, known to Ethan from briefings, was built on acquisition rather than ideology. He took what his employers wanted and left nothing behind. Bullets struck metal, sending sparks and fragments into the air. The archive responded, shelves rotating to create barriers, corridors narrowing, as if the building itself were trying to slow the intrusion without choosing sides. "Go," Ethan said to Maggie, pressing a portable drive into her hand, already loaded with what she had gathered. "There's a tunnel marked on the old schematics, designed for worst-case scenarios." Maggie hesitated, fear warring with understanding. She had never run from an argument before, but this was not debate. This was erasure. She nodded once, clutching the drive, and sprinted toward the indicated passage as another volley of gunfire rang out. Ethan stayed. He drew his weapon, movements crisp, economical, placing himself between the attackers and the core archive. The space was too tight for prolonged engagement, but he used it, forcing close quarters, angles that negated their numbers. He fired sparingly, with intent to delay rather than dominate, each shot punctuating the air with controlled violence. Hale cursed, signaling his team to flank, but the archive had other plans. A shelf rotated abruptly, slamming into one of the attackers, pinning him with a metallic groan. The building was not allied, but it was resistant. Maggie reached the tunnel entrance, a heavy hatch disguised beneath a console panel. It opened onto a narrow passage reinforced with concrete and steel, the kind built when survival had been measured in megatons. The air was stale but breathable. She ran, heart pounding, the echo of gunfire chasing her footsteps. Behind her, Ethan fell back toward the core, triggering a sequence he had hoped not to use. Charges, small and precisely placed, designed not to destroy but to collapse access points. He waited until Maggie's signal came through the comm, a single word, breathless but alive, then detonated. The explosion was contained, a concussive thump that rippled through the basement. The main access corridor caved in, sealing the archive behind tons of concrete and twisted metal. Dust filled the air, alarms dying mid-cry. Ethan staggered, ears ringing, then forced himself upright, retreating into a secondary passage as the attackers scrambled, suddenly cut off from their objective. Above, the city went on, unaware that history had nearly been stolen beneath its feet. Maggie emerged hours later through an unmarked service exit beyond the university grounds, rain washing dust from her coat, the drive heavy in her pocket. She did not look back. Somewhere below, the library slept again, buried not by neglect, but by choice. The data had escaped, the message had been carried forward, and in the dark beneath the city, the archive held its silence, intact enough to wait. The city learned the truth the way cities always did, not in a single revelation, but in a ripple. It began with a quiet release at dawn, mirrored across continents, time-stamped to the same minute in Washington, Berlin, Tokyo, and Nairobi. Archives opened their doors at once, not with spectacle, but with access. Datasets unlocked, reels digitized, annotations shared. The microfilm's contents, once hidden beneath stone and fear, now lived in daylight. Attempts to claim ownership dissolved the moment exclusivity vanished. No nation could corner a truth that belonged everywhere at the same time. The chase ended without a victory parade, without a battlefield. It ended because transparency left no shadows large enough to hide in. Maggie Whitmore watched the first wave of responses from a borrowed office overlooking the river, her reflection faint in the glass as she read. She looked thinner than she had weeks earlier, exhaustion sharpening her features, but her eyes were steady, brighter than before. The room smelled of coffee and wet coats. The ordinary scent of work resumed. She had changed clothes twice since the night of the escape. The tremor in her hands had faded. On the table beside her lay the portable drive, now empty, its contents scattered into the world. She touched it once, lightly, as if to say goodbye. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood in the shadow of a plane tree near the university gates, watching reporters cluster and disperse. He looked like any other man waiting for nothing in particular. Coat unremarkable, posture relaxed. The explosion underground had left him with a faint ringing in his ears that came and went like a tide. But otherwise he bore no visible marks. He had filed his last report the night before, concise, factual, stripped of adjectives. It would pass through channels and be filed away, useful precisely because it offered no leverage. For the first time in years, he felt no pull toward the next assignment. The idea of distance, of staying, felt less like retreat and more like alignment. The announcement came later that morning. The library would be reopened, not as it had been, but as something new. Excavation crews worked with care rather than urgency, lifting collapsed concrete like a wound tended instead of pride. The defensive mechanisms, once clever and ruthless, were dismantled piece by piece. Shelves that had rotated to block intruders were fixed in place. Corridors were widened, lights softened. The building breathed differently now, relieved of the duty to defend itself. When the last panel was removed, the microfilm reader was found intact, its casing scratched but whole. It would be displayed without glass. At the opening, Maggie stood beside a woman she had never met, but felt she knew. Dr. Eleanor Price was in her late 60s, tall and spare, with a mane of white hair she refused to tame. Her eyes were kind but unsentimental, shaped by decades of arguing for nuance in rooms that preferred certainty. Eleanor had chaired the ethics committee overseeing the archive's transition, and when she spoke, she did so plainly, as if the truth did not need embellishment to be persuasive. "We do not preserve these materials to predict," she said. "We preserve them to remember consequences. Memory is a form of mercy." A dog wandered through the crowd, unnoticed by most. He was a graying retriever, old enough that his muzzle had softened to silver, his gait careful but determined. He belonged to the groundskeeper, a quiet man who had worked the campus for 30 years and knew which door stuck and which stones shifted in winter. The dog paused near the entrance, tail wagging slowly, then lay down in a patch of sun as if he had decided the place was safe. Maggie smiled at the sight, a simple benediction. Inside, the exhibits did not dramatize. Reels were paired with outcomes, predictions with aftermaths. Visitors moved slowly, reading, arguing in hushed tones, sometimes stopping to sit. Children asked earnest questions. An elderly man wiped his eyes at a panel describing a crisis he had survived. The eyes, those unblinking watchers from the first reel, were explained at last as a composite image, built from hundreds of faces of the project's founders, an intentional reminder that the future was observed by people, not machines. The effect was disarming. To be watched by care rather than control changed everything. Ethan attended the opening at Maggie's insistence, arriving late, leaving early. He stood near the back, listening. When Maggie found him, she did not thank him. She never had. Instead, she spoke about what came next: fellowships, oversight boards, the long work of stewardship. He listened, nodding, asking the questions that mattered. "I'm done running," he said finally, the words surprising him with their ease. He had been shaped by pursuit, of threats, of certainty. Letting go felt like setting down a weight he had mistaken for a limb. Weeks passed. The news cycle moved on. Attempts to undermine the release flared and fizzled, starved of secrecy. The archive settled into routine. Maggie accepted the role of custodian, not director. She believed guardianship required humility. She hired widely, listened fiercely, wrote carefully. The nights grew quieter. Sometimes she stayed late, walking the aisles after the doors had closed, the hum of lights a comfort rather than a warning. Ethan took an office no one had asked for, a small room with a window that opened onto the courtyard. He advised when asked, declined when not. His suits grew less severe. He learned the rhythms of the place, when the bells rang wrong, when the dog slept, when students argued with joy. He found that stillness did not dull him. It clarified. On a cool evening, as autumn leaned toward winter, Maggie and Ethan walked the underground level together for the first time since it had been restored. The air was clean, the lights warm. The microfilm reader stood ready, inert without urgency. Maggie placed a hand on its casing, then withdrew it. "We won't need to hide again," she said. Ethan nodded. "Trust is harder," he replied, "but it lasts longer." They paused at the threshold where the rotating shelf had once turned secrets into corridors. It was fixed now, books returned to their places, spines aligned. no mechanism waited beneath the surface. The choice felt right. Some doors, once opened, did not need to spin again. Above them, the city breathed, unremarkable and alive. The future, unmonitored and unafraid, unfolded at its own pace. The eyes had watched long enough. Their work was done.